U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on a four-country tour of Africa. Washington seeks to reinforce a growing partnership with Angola, promoting a major infrastructure project and coordinating on conflict mediation. Blinken also visited Nigeria, Ivory Coast and Cape Verde on a week-long trip meant to demonstrate the sustained U.S. interest on the continent as China and Russia gain influence and the Israel-Hamas war consumes Washington's attention. Earlier I spoke with Professor John Stremlau on the United States plan for the continent. This is how our conversation went.
Professor Stremlau, it's always great to speak to you, and thank you for speaking to us on Africa today. Subject of our conversation is U.S. Secretary Blinken, who's in West Africa at the moment. In fact, he's just watched Ivory Coast demolished a few days ago by 4-0. So not a good start to his trip. But let's talk about more political issues. What is the objective of this four-nation trip?
I think what the objective is to show that the Biden administration is interested and cares about Africa. Biden has not been here, but Blinken has. This is his fourth trip, and there have been 17 cabinet-level visits to Africa, and this is not, in my view, a counter move toward Russia or to China, but more figuring out what the African agency is and how the U.S. could be helpful. But that's the spin that they're giving unofficially, and so I'm happy to take any questions about the real motivations.
Now, Biden did speak about visiting Africa a lot more often, or at least a lot more than he's done. Should we read anything into his absence of travel to Africa?
No, it's not, because it's been a busy year, and yesterday's primary in New Hampshire was a reminder that this is an election year, and every other country is probably trying to figure out whether Donald Trump will emerge victorious in November. That's a whole other subject. But what Blinken is trying to do, I think, at a domestic political level, is to signal the Biden administration's concern about Africa at a time when 40 million African Americans are in the play for the 2024 election, and they have consistently supported the Democratic Party since the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, and the Republicans have gone increasingly racist, and now Donald Trump is Make America Great Again for whom, you know? But they want to signal to Africa that they're concerned about the security situation, they're concerned about economic development, but also to signal to African American constituency, the 40 million, that it takes Africa seriously. You know, when he's in Nigeria today, and the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, number 2 behind Janet Yellen, is Wally Adeyemo, who was born in Ibadan, for heaven's sakes.
Now, obviously, security concerns are an issue, particularly in the Sahel region. Now, what's prompting the U.S. to take action, and as far as visiting some of those countries is concerned?
Well, they're talking about a big package of security assistance, and I don't know the details of that package, but it is a concern with the Wagner Group that has been very active in the Sahelian countries, Niger, Chad, CAR, and Mali. It is a very difficult period for that group, but also for Nigeria because of Boko Haram and the insurgencies there. So it's not a lot of stability in that part of the world, but his first stop was to Cape Verde, where it's a small country, but it's also a democracy, and there is an alternative to authoritarianism, which the African Union and its constitutive act and the charter, the African Charter, has celebrated as norms for integration in this complex region. So I think that Blinken is playing the long game, but whether or not he'll get a second term is a question that is at the heart of American politics right now.
Well, a big question also, Professor, is the effectiveness of any security apparatus that the United States or any other foreign power might bring to Africa in order to try and achieve some stability. Now, if we try and draw parallels to the DRC, for instance, where President Felix Tshisekedi has kicked out U.S. peacekeepers and a number of other forces, because for many, many years they've been present in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but as you and I well know, there's been no stability.
No, there has been no stability. That's not a new story. The colonial demarcation of Africa has been very arbitrary and very problematic. Obviously, the Congo is a case in point, and I fault the United States for seeing the previous dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, as a Cold War ally at the expense of the Congolese people. And what you're seeing now, and I went to the Congo for the '06 election, which when I was at the Carter Center, and which South Africa invested in, and President Thabo Mbeki invested heavily in trying to stabilize the Congo. And the head of the electoral management body now is the former head of Dennis Kadima, former head of the Electoral Institute of Sustainable Democracy in Africa, which is based in South Africa. And so therefore, I watch it with interest, but it is not an easy solution. And the question in the Sahel is, with Niger having had a coup, is that big base, that $100 million base that the U.S. is building to try to support governments in the Sahel in the insurgency against the insurgents with the drones, is that going to be viable? I don't think so. So, Blinken has got a lot of things to ask Ouattara in Ivory Coast, and to talk to Tinubu in Nigeria about, with regard to security issues. But there's more to life than the security issues.
I'm glad you raised that issue around there is more to life than security issues. I mean, issues of sustenance. Poverty is a watch in many of those areas. Is it something that he's likely to look at? I mean, he talks about a comprehensive approach to dealing with this. Does comprehensive suggest that there will be other factors that will be looked at just outside of security on its own?
Absolutely. Health care is a primary interest of the United States. So they've invested very heavily in PEPFAR and other health issues. But I want to make a point that gets back to the Chinese role in Africa. Biden, you alluded to the Africa Cup match that was played in a stadium that the Chinese built. And the Chinese have done a lot of work on hardware. But and Linda Thomas Greenfield, the former ambassador to Liberia, was on this trip, and now is at the UN. And she knows how the Chinese and the Americans can work together in complementary fashion in Liberia, which I have seen, where the Chinese build the hospitals and the U.S. puts in the software, and there is a division of labor. It's not talked about greatly. But I would hope that you could have a win-win-win again. It's a confidence-building region, Africa, for U.S.-China relations, and it should not be an uncontrolled competition. But it does require African agency, and that's something I think Blinken will be talking about, because they are trying to downplay the risk of another Cold War in Africa, which it's counterproductive. The last one didn't do Africa any good at all, and now, as we just alluded to in the Congo, and now we do have an opportunity for a win-win-win.
Now, you did talk about Blinken may not get another term in office. It's maybe 10 or 11 months away from knowing if he does. Is this likely to play a part in some of these conversations? Because he may only be in office for another 10 or 11 months, and then policy might shift.
Well, of course, and that's the problem of dealing with a democracy. And the headline out of Davos was that the one question everybody had on its mind, the business leaders, was how reliable would the U.S. be? And business leaders have spoken out now in favor of Trump, but it would just be another tax cut. I mean, it was chaos when the last Trump administration, and maybe this one will be more coherent but more autocratic. And so, therefore, the stakes are very, very high. But that's an American issue. But I would hope that governments in Africa would realize that there is a stake that they have in this, and how their kith and kin in the African American community vote is really important. We're in a period of very fluid relations, and yet every government is having to hedge because they don't know how reliable the U.S. is. China is autocratic and Russia is autocratic, but at least Putin and Xi are predictable so long as they're there. But in the case of democracies, it's a work in progress always. As we know in South Africa, this big election here is an inflection point for South Africa.
It raises the questions of trust between African nations and the Western countries, because many of them would seem to serve their own interests. It's almost seldom ever a win-win situation.
It is, and you're right, but at the same time, it is penetrable. And this is a really tricky issue for an international relations professor who has grown up thinking that the state is the rational actor. No, it's what happens within countries. South Africa is playing on the global stage domestically. I mean, how can foreign governments take South Africa seriously when it's got such problems with its state-owned enterprises, for example? And that's understood by most of the voters, but they're going to have to vote on themselves for an improved a state, which will then be more authoritative in the international community. And similarly, if Biden gets a second term, I think that a lot of foreign governments will breathe a sigh of relief, not Putin perhaps, but everyone else, and then get on with it. Because the U.S. is not the global superpower that it once was, and yet the Chinese don't offer a realistic alternative. So there is a pluralism at work in the international community.
Professor Stremlau, always great to hear your opinions on Africa today. Thanks so much for speaking to us.